on existential constructions in Nielsen 1967. No, there isn't. It includes, Nielsen 1967 does include morphemes and also word order phenomena that are frequently attested in present-day existential constructions, but nothing on existential constructions as such. Now, is that significant? Yes, probably. So maybe there is the same question like, did Proto-Bantu have negation? Yes, it had, but then you want to reconstruct negative markers. Did it have existential constructions? Probably. So you want to reconstruct an existential marker, but that's not what we're going to do, or we didn't find an existential marker to reconstruct. But first, things first, the existential construction, conceptualization and formal characteristics. We follow Cressels in the way he defines existential constructions. He defines existential constructions in relation to locative clauses. And in comparison to the latter, they involve an alternative way of encoding the prototypical figure-ground relationship. The ground, rather than the figure, is the perspectival center. So if in Swahili you have kitabu kipo mezani, then you are saying something about the book, which is on the table. But if you say mezani kuna kitabu, then you say something about the table on which is lying a book. This change in perspective is typically, cross-linguistically, reflected by a change in word order. So you get, where you normally have figure-predicator, you get predicator-figure. Meeuwsen does discuss existential constructions in his publications on Chiluba syntax. And there he says, so he starts with a locative clause, Kabundi is in his cave, and then he says, okay, Kabundi is a subject, that's the previously known point of departure, it's a psychological subject, and Mumutunda is a predicate, and that expresses something that is new for the hearer, that is the psychological predicate. But then he continues and adds that the locative phrase can also be the psychological subject, and the grammatical subject can be the psychological predicate. And in Chiluba, the verb can even agree with the locative in such cases. And then he adds that, well, our European terms, like in the example in 3, but our European terms, subject and predicate, do not sufficiently explain the relations expressed in these Chiluba sentences. And so he tried out, it's a Dutch article, and he said, well, maybe aanloop, and I have difficulties translating that, run-up, and afloop, run-off, or outcome, could be useful here. Well, what? Onset. And off, yeah. Yes, but no, it's well, offset, but yeah. But okay, we continue on that, that in recent typological studies on existential constructions, well, people also don't use a different terminology. So there's a kind of a template for the typical components of an existential construction. And you see it in 4, where you have the expletive, the proform, the copula, the pivot, and the coda. Like this. But the coda is the locative, so that wouldn't be so that's not really what you said. But the pivot is the only obligatory explicit constituent cross-linguistically, and so the other elements are explained, but let's look at the examples. There are some books on the table, then there is the proform, then you have a copula, some books is the pivot, and then you have on the table is the coda. Il y a des livres sur la table. You have an expletive, a proform, a copula, a pivot, and a coda. Then there's also languages that have the coda in front. No centro da cidade tinha engarrafamento enorme, coda, copula, pivot, and then if you apply this to Swahili, then you have mezani, kuna kitabu, you have the coda, you have the proform, ku, the locative marker on the copula, and then the pivot, kitabu. So what we want to do now, and I'm still questioning this, but is that we want to reconstruct the morphosyntactic patterns, the pattern for, or patterns for Proto-Bantu, so the construction and its building blocks. What are our data, and then some parameters for categorization. Our findings are based on a sample of 100 Bantu languages, and I should mention Hannah here because we worked on this together. Actually, she should have been part of this. We were too late in doing that well. So it's a convenient sample. Like if you are 3, then you look at the languages you work on and around, and then, but it still includes all zones and regions. There is a caveat. Because existentials they are seldomly described extensively, if at all, and so we had to expand on Chrysa's narrow criteria. And for Kirundi that worked really well. So you have in 5a there is a book on the table. That's a typical for in Chrysa's terminology. That is a typical existential. But then there are a lot of fat people when there is no coda implied or there's no ground implied. That is a less typical one, but we did look at those ones as well if we found them. And then once upon a time there was a man. We also included those because if you look at the stories at the end of the grammars, then often you find exactly these constructions. But still you have to be careful because if you look at the Lega data, for example, then you see in 6 that there is a difference. So in the copula, so in him there was life, which is a existential, like in Chrysa's terms, a prototypical one. Then you have the B, the ba form, and then if you have it at the beginning of the story, like a presentational existential, then you use end, and we found that in other languages as well, and other differences, like in Shangaji, you would have a locative enclitic in the true existential construction, but you would leave it out in this kind of presentational constructions. So we probably made mistakes, but yeah, still, that's what we had. And then there's the parameters. So the first one is when we were making these types, the first thing we looked at was, does it have a permuted word order or not? So a shifting word order relative to the plain locational class, we already mentioned, so figure, predicator versus predicator figure. We already saw an example of a permuted existential, but there are some more in 7 and 8, and in 7 you see that the figure, that the copula agrees with the figure, which follows the copula, but then in 8 you see that the figure, that the copula no longer agrees with the figure, but rather with the locative, with the coda than the ground. I will continue using figure and ground most of the time. And then you have non-permuted existentials. Well, like the example in 9 from Gunu, there is paper on the ground, or the paper is on the ground, and actually there's no way of making a difference. For Lingala, I talked to Michael Mewis about this, and he said, well, you can make a difference, but then you should add an indefinite pronoun, not by changing words or anything. So you can say a certain book. If you say a certain book, then there is a book on the table. That's the more probable interpretation. It's very rare in our sample, with only 11 attestations in the 100 language sample, but still a fine number. But and it's confined to the Northwest. It's also rare cross-linguistically, not to be able to make a difference. Then the second parameter is between dedicated and non-dedicated existentials. For us, we have been struggling a bit with that and had comments about that, but for us, non-dedicated existentials are identical to plain locational clauses except for word order change. So we do not consider the permuted word order alone as a sufficient parameter for a construction being dedicated. So the Swahili Kipo Kitabu Mezani, which is like Kitabu Kipo Mezani, but you have only the word order change, but no changes in agreement, is not a dedicated one. And it often, very often in our data occurs in tandem with a dedicated one. So what do dedicated existentials look like? Well, they have some kind of morphosyntactic specialization, but now I give the floor
thank you very much.
to Rasmus.
So, dedicated existentials in Bantu. So, so we 3 out of 7 of Chrysed's types of existential predicative constructions have been identified in Bantu. So these are the locative existential type, the possessive locative existential type, and the commutative existential type. So very long names of these types. So starting with the locative existential type, it's characterized as involving some kind of locative marking, which is absent from plain locational constructions. And we found 5 subtypes of locative existentials as well, and we present 3 today because the 2 others are very rare or somehow unclear status, so we don't think they're likely as anything else than local innovations anyway. So the first subtype consists of locative subic marker plus copula, which by definition is different from plain locational clauses as the figure is no longer marked as an agreement on the copula verb. So this is an example from by this former supervisor Laura with the locative class 16 in Chewa, in example number 12. The second subtype consists of copula plus a locative referential marker, which is used for Fourier cross-reference to locative constituents. So most typically it is a post-final marker, but we also find some pre-final markers in some languages. But most typically it's a post-final marker attached to the rightmost end of the verb stem. And despite the transparent locative origin, these post-finals, in many cases, they do not surface in basic or plain locational locational predications, if not dislocated and so on, but not when the coda is in its regular position. Whereas in copula constructions where the first participant follows the verb, that is an existential constructions according to us then, there are cases where the post-final marker is not only acceptable but even obligatory. So this is, for example, the case with the existential construction versus the plain locational in Ikisu, exemplified in 13 and 14. The third subtype is a combination of strategy A and B. So you will have both a locative subic marker and a locative referential marker, as in Luganda. Now, the locative referential denotations of these different markers may have become more or less bleached and consequently detached from the original function of referring back to a specific locus, which then would make them correspond to either the expletive and or the proform of this morphosyntactic template that Maud presented. Not always, but sometimes this bleaching can be evidenced by occasional mismatches between the locative class of the locus and the locative class of the subic marker, as this class 18, class 17 mismatch in Yakuza. But this of course only goes for languages without a reduced locative agreement system. So for example, in Kinyarwanda, for example, where it's always agreement with the class 16 and so on. Okay, so the second existential type, which we were a bit surprised to find, was the possessive locative existential type, which is a construction transparently consisting of a locative element, in this case a locative subic marker, and a verb with a lexical meaning have. And this is a very rare type in Bantu, and Gwen was the only language of our sample. But there seem to be some more languages in the same area, with the same type of existential, but is outside of our sample. So, and this is not probably also a very local innovation, but we wanted to mention it because of the functional overlap with the commutative existential type, which we will discuss now. But we just want to mention before that the commutative particle na do surface in Bueno as well, but only as a preposition. Okay, so the commutative existential type, the final type of Bantu existentials, it involves the use of a commutative element, and it has been presented as a very characteristic feature of Bantu languages. And most often it's a variant then of the formative na, as in Swana and Digo. And you should please note here that the pivot occurs after the copula, also in this kind of constructions. And also that the locative marking, once again, is typically involved also in this existential type, so locative subject marking. Or at least marking of locative origin. So I guess the Swana is an expletive, but it's derived from locative class 17 some point in time. But this is not necessarily the case. So, for example, take a Evo, and some other B and C languages use an expletive subject marker derived from, well, it doesn't look like it's derived from any locative class at all. And of importance for the further discussion and reconstruction, we should also mention already here that the commutative typically also has an extended function cross Bantu as a possessive marker. So that's the functional overlap with the possessive locative type, which means that the commutative existential in Bantu languages share strong similarities with the cross-linguistically more common existentials which originate from predicative possession. So we will discuss this further in the next section. Over to you. How is the weather looking this weekend?
So the third part is reconstructing Bantu existential constructions. And then the first thing we looked at is frequency, distribution, and typology, so maybe all the wrong reasons to reconstruct, but still. At least an important note is that at least 23% of the languages, it's simple when you have 100 languages, but have more than one existential construction. And then if you have the table next to it, so they are marked in bold. So there's more than 100 languages in the table, but so the bold ones appear twice or more, because sometimes they have 3 or 4 strategies. And then Shangaji is a case in point. You have a non-dedicated existential construction, Ziwapo Miri Owar. Are there trees where you live? And it does have something that looks like a locative and clitic, but it also appears in the plain locational clause. So to say that the trees are somewhere, you would still say Miri Ziwapo. They are available, or if you want to add where, then it's the same construction, only the word order changed. Then you have a dedicated locative existential construction, Zariu Vitu Pure Parapatro. There were a lot of things in Angosh, and here it's not the same as a plain locational clause because the locative and clitic is never present in the plain locational clause. So if you want to say that the things are in Angosh, you would say V2 where, then you would say V2 Zari Parapat. And then you have a dedicated possessive existential. Now I have to look at the handout because I forgot the. Okay. Okay. Yes, that's the one. Mwinziwa pu kuna let himo. So that in this breast there's no milk. And that uses the na, the commutative. No, so that it should have been, sorry, instead of possessive existential, that's the commutative type existential, I'm sorry. So, yes, that's about these multiple strategies. And then the italics in the table, they indicate that the subject prefix is a non-locative expletive marker. Yes. So then if we look at the table, we are not going to exclude the non-permuted ones, so the northwest, but Rasmus is going to talk about that. But then obviously the most well spread and also geographically best distributed ones are the locative existential type and the commutative existential type, and also typologically that's a common change. So to go from a locative to an existential, or from this, no, I say possessive construction again, but that's because of the link between the commutative and the possessive Bantu languages, which actually, well, if it's typologically a natural phenomenon, then it could have happened independently. So, but still, we try to reconstruct these two types. One common trait is the locative marking, and if we now look, so those are the patterns that we would like to reconstruct. Now, can we also reconstruct the building blocks? Actually, a lot of the building blocks have been reconstructed, so the locative noun classes and their agreement sets, and then the languages that do not have this locative marking are mostly forest languages, and they are known for the absence of locative clauses. So, if we want to reconstruct a locative existential construction, then type A is the most well spread one. It's frequent, it's well distributed, and it automatically comes with explicit marking of the reperspectivization of the figure grounds relationship. Also, all formal subparts can be reconstructed, have been reconstructed, and then, but then a question about this permuted word order, the locative inversion. Meeuwsen mentions, I don't know how you say that in English, I would say anastasis, but in the Bantu grammatical reconstructions and in his Kirundi grammar, he describes locative existential constructions and also locative inversion constructions as a special case of reversement. So, and there is wind is an example. More recent studies then show rather that locative inversion is the fundamental variant of inversion in Bantu, and there is an implicational hierarchy following which the presence of locative inversion with other types of verbs in a language implies the presence of locative inversion with a copula. So then maybe this locative existential type could be the fundamental variant of locative inversion. So maybe we can reconstruct this locative inversion together with this construction. Then the other two types are less likely. Why? Well, especially type C is very local, and then the type B is also not particularly frequent, and formally less stable. So we only gave examples with enclitics, but sometimes it's a proclitic, sometimes it's an object prefix. So we put everything together, but so that's not a, the form is less stable.
And also, I should maybe add also one thing, there is also a very common grammaticalization pathway actually cross-linguistically for this kind of phoric cross-reference locative markers to become a dedicated existential as well. So that's also one thing that makes it less likely.
Okay, thank you. And then, so on to the commutative existential construction. Well, if we reconstruct that kind of construction, then it's probably the type where you have the copula combining with the na-commutative marker. And again, all the formal parts have been reconstructed. And then, so we just show this kind of construction in 25. You have the one with the copula and then the commutative marker, and then you see that that's probably an innovation that this commutative marker becomes a copula. And then you see very nicely in Swana that when that has happened, then a commutative marker can again join this former commutative marker. And then so this extension, well, it's not really an extension because B width is to have, but this is fundamental, that the B width can express to have, and then we come back to the Gueno case. So if a language innovates a verb to have, then you see that this commutative marker, if it's not used to express to have, then it can't be used in an existential construction. Maybe I put it too strongly, but still. So, but I said we wouldn't forget these Northwest languages, and we aren't. I will forget them, but Rasmus won't.
I wish I could, eh?
No.
Because they messed everything up. All the nice patterns, but because we looked at the picture beyond narrow Bantu, and we tried to look at closest relatives also outside of Bantu, and this is very much a convenience sample, and it's largely based on Kreisel's data, so we only know that. But as you can see in this table, yeah, it's on there on page 13 and 14. Almost all languages which are not oh, this table a question mark, but okay.
Yes.
That's, I hope it's no problem with that. But as you can see, almost all languages which are not narrow Bantu have non-permuted and non-dedicated existentials. So, for example, in Mancon, which is a grassfields language, there is no difference between expressing plain locational and existential meaning. And the same verb in conjunction with ni, with, can be used to express have, so that would be something similar pattern as we see in Bantu then, but this collocation is not used to express an existential meaning, as you can see in 29. Can you please double check so I'm yes. Right, so I don't say, yeah, okay. This is also a bit tricky, my French is not what it should be, so which exemplifies both the existential and the possessive use. Okay, and also Obolo is one of the few languages which do have a dedicated, in this case what Kreisel calls a trans-possessive existential, which is basically the same as a locative existential, but instead of a locative there's some other kind of expletive involved. But well, to start with, Obolo is relatively distant from Bantu, right? It's a cross-river language and so on. And contra Kreisels, it seems to also have a non-dedicated, non-permuted existential, so it's kind of falls into the same patterns as the other Benue Congo languages. And we forgot to number these two examples.
Yeah,
so they are
319 in the
suddenly, but I hope you get the picture anyway. Okay, so what one thing which characterizes Benue Congo minus narrow Bantu is the fact that it's a core member of the Macro-Sudan belt, and this also, by the way, goes for all the Obangan languages that we have included in this table, if we have understood correctly. And Kreisel has suggested that an additional defining linguistic feature of the Macro-Sudan area is the lack of any formal or constituent ordering differences between plain locational and existential expressions. So 55 of 79 languages of this sample from the Macro-Sudan belt share this trait, so, and of which most of the remaining 24 languages belong to Atlantic and Shadic, so they are both considered more peripheral members of the Macro-Sudan belt, and they're also quite spoken quite far away from Bantu. And what is of course noteworthy for us and our reconstruction is then that the Bantu languages from zones A, C, and also D, with non-dedicated and non-permuted existentials, border on this linguistic area. So, because existentials are different in the Northwest in at least two crucial ways, as we have touched upon already briefly, that they are not permuted or inverted, and they are not dedicated. And this, of course, complicates the reconstruction of any existential for Proto-Bantu. So it's the similar problem as we have discussed a lot, I think, during this conference. Because these languages are on the one hand they're situated highest up in the tree, so to say, but on the other hand they are renowned for being less conservative and also having replicated some macro-Sudan area features, some other features as well. So it kind of boils down to the question, does the non-commuted and non-dedicated existentials in the ACD languages represent the very early Bantu structural state, where permutation, dedication are all later innovations then, perhaps in this node 3 that we kind of always end up or is this plain existential the result of a later areal diffusion? And we have tried to list some pros and cons. So we don't know ourselves really, but let's go through them and see what you think. So on the one hand, one might argue that it might seem a bit counterintuitive to kind of go back to a non-distinctive basic word order. That would be the case if this is an earlier feature. And it also is at least plausible, I guess, to posit that Niger-Congo in general and the Niger-Congo in particular, as a prominent core member of the macro-Sudan belt, was also the donor, so to say, of plain existentials. And so it was also kind of inherited in Proto and early Bantu as well, permuted and dedicated existentials being later innovations. But on the other hand, it's actually extremely rare cross-linguistically to have identical existential and plain locational expressions. If not marked by some kind of shift in word order, there will be some morphologically specialized construction at least. So there's nothing basic with this situation. It is a really marked feature, which is worth pointing out. And then, of course, there are these things like inversion. Inversion itself is reconstructive of Proto-Bantu in previous work, so that should point us at some direction. Maybe this is more speculative, but Narrow-Bantu is not part of the canonical macro-Sudan area, which could also suggest that it might be more likely as a target than a donor. And also that these Bantu languages which have non-permuted and non-dedicated existentials do not only border onto other Benue-Congo, but also Banyan and Central Sudanic languages, which all also have the same feature. And to this we also may add that low-numbered B languages also have permuted word order, whereas, well, at least Bodo, D35, do not have permuted word order. And Bodo is a member of, relatively speaking, a late offshoot, but on the one hand, but on the other hand, border on the macro-Sudan area, directly to the north. Oh, time over. Okay, so this is just. Okay, but yeah, we just list everything which might, so I just go through this very quickly, if it's okay. Okay. So also that we found also that a few other Bantu languages outside of the forest, so to speak, without an obligatory post-copular pivot in existential constructions, are member of these groups F30, GA40, which are also very characterized by living in these sprachbunds or being in contact with a lot of non-Bantu varieties, so like Nata, which have been heavily influenced by Datoga and other languages, both Nilotic and Cushitic languages. And then finally, as we have already touched upon, Northwest Bantu is often characterized in terms of reduction and loss in relation to mainstream Bantu, and there appears to be a correlation between non-permuted existentials and loss or heavy restrictions of locative noun class affixation, which without any doubt, I would say, was part of Proto-Bantu. And as locative agreement is a crucial part of the dedicated existential types in Bantu, it's plausible to posit that the dedicated existential disappeared together with the locative agreement system. So I don't know if it's already obvious, perhaps, that we're kind of leaning towards the idea that the plain existential is a macro-Sudan diffusion. But in any case, we would say that there are strong indications for that dedicated existentials existed, if not in Proto-Bantus, at least in very early Bantu. Thank you.
10 minutes for questions. Yes.
If you have separated the dedicated from the non-dedicated in your database in the presentation at a very early stage, but just followed the cells on, would the possessive type be much more frequent? I mean, the possessive type, like Swahili, with the na, I mean, kuna.
Much more frequent than the...
Well, now it's absent almost, except for bueno.
No, that's in the comitative type. It's all over. Like the Swahili na.
Yeah.
That's what we call the.
Or you call it.
There's a comitative type.
Yeah.
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 Okay. So the fact that it is also the normal only way to express having doesn't count.
Yes, it's.
Yes.
Sorry,
No.
It's
No,
necessary. I mean,
but
it must be involved in the expression of having. So, to be used in this existential construction, or that's what we think. So you have the copula plus na, and then you have the na used as a copula. We both consider them as being the comitative type, and this meaning of having is a central part of that. But so, and that's what we try to say, that the comitative and the possessive type in Bantu are very difficult. They are difficult to distinguish. I mean, they're very closely related. So what the only possessive ones we have are those that do not, that have a verb that is not derived from the comitative.
And another question is, where is the line from the locative subject to the, is that, if there's a specifier like Nyumbani humu kunagiza, in this house it is dark, or there is, I mean, it's a translational thing, whether you say, translate with there is, it is, or it has, the place, you put the place first in the whatever translation you have. Is it, is translation independent criterion for?
This would
if you have it, if you have a demonstrative there, or to specifying it, I mean, it doesn't, it's not generic anymore, right?
No.
Is it existential?
Well, according to Chrysal's criteria, that would be an existential still, yes, but of course that's the. Yeah. Right.
Yes.
Two points. One is, I mean, it's all very well to quote Harold Hamstrong on this, but you know, he's a very extreme point of view, not shared by most mainstream people working on Niger Congo. Very extreme. I mean, he throws out all sorts of families and breaks up all sorts of families. That's fine to him, but I don't think you should use it. But I'm more concerned about your use of sources outside Bantu.
Okay.
Number one on page 13 is Bassa. You've got the wrong language family completely. This is a thesis about the Bassa, which is a Kayanji language. Now this thesis is about the case system of Bassa. Now of course Bassa doesn't have a case system like all the other languages. So this doesn't suggest this is a reliable source on this language, to me anyway. I think we should scrap this sort of completely unreliable source. If you mix unreliable sources with secondary, I mean most of this is, you know, from Chrysal's secondary sources. I mean I think you've really got to go back to the original sources.
The example we gave, we went back to.
No, I mean, you know, anyway, because this is the sort of completely unreliable source, so I would never use as evidence for anything.
Yes.
Roger, is there a mainstream if it comes to Niger Congo?
I'm sorry?
Is there a mainstream if it comes to Niger Congo?
Well, I think there are more mainstream versions than Harold.
I see a lot of streams, but
Ethanol is a fairly mainstream. mainstream consensus version.
Okay, I had a question, but it's not. It's more in terms of historical reconstruction. You seem to, if I've understood well, to like to contradict the reconstruction scenario with the macro Sudan belt contact scenario. But if I've understood well, and Tom might contradict me, but given the time depth of the macro Sudan belt area, there's no necessarily an opposition or a contradiction between reconstructing something to Proto-Bantu and being a feature that can be dedicated to the macro Sudan belt area, if I'm right. So, no? If Proto-Bantu, if that's a deep time language area, linguistic area, and Proto-Bantu was part of it or was influenced by it, I think some features might, no? Or
well, I think the argument of typological profile of the homeland area is just a single piece in a more complex argument. I think one shouldn't overstate this point. I think it's just a single argument, and I think the primary data to reconstruct something comes from the data in the family. So I think this. Yes, I use the macro Sudan belt as one thing for instance, my argument on predicate structure, but I think one shouldn't give it too much weight. The primary argument should be historical comparative reconstruction of the data in a family, and of course, if it plays out with the macro Sudan belt, that would be another argument, but it could be the other way around as well. Yeah, that Bantu, for whatever reason, already differed from the macro Sudan, because there are hundreds of languages in the macro Sudan belt who don't comply with the macro Sudan feature. And not just on the periphery, but it can be really inside the area. So it's really, one shouldn't.
But so you agree that one does not contradict
Yes.
the other?
Yes, Timmy.
Sorry, to understand the big table with the comparison with languages outside of Bantu, that the commutative existential type is rare, very rare there? Or
only in Baka is the only.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is interesting by itself, but yeah.
Just Mark and I have worked on Bula last year? Yeah, a little bit, so, and it's Jarawan Bantu, yes. So, and there the copula is na, and the commutative is num with the swap, which is maybe, I don't know, I don't want to make any claims, but it just looks quite similar to the commutative.
Yeah. That's very cool. Yes.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
I'll ask a follow-up question then. Koen, were you suggesting that because we don't find the inversion existentials in the Northwest, we should not reconstruct this kind of inversion for Bantu? And in addition, the macro Sudan belt does not have this inversion word order. And if so, how would you explain the rest of the inversion constructions? Because I understood that Maud and Rasmus were arguing that the fact that you find the non-inverted, or what did you say, non-permuted?
Non-permuted is
non-permuted
nice.
word order. The fact that you don't find that doesn't mean that it can't be reconstructed for Proto-Bantu because of the influence of the macro Sudan belt.
Yeah, I don't know. That's the general question. I mean, that's this goes back to many things we have discussed. If you go out, you start out from the synchronic evidence which is there, and if it's missing in the Northwest, yeah, then I would not reconstruct it to Proto-Bantu, including Northwest. But yeah.
Unless you can explain how it disappeared from.
Yeah, unless you can, or if but.
So you don't find the discussion that Maud and Rasmus provided in that last bit convincing to say that the lack of that inversion is due to the aerial influence?
Yeah, but which would then be later then?
But that's what we find now. So
No, but
which-
what I mean is if it's,
Could be big.
I think, but I don't have a strong opinion on that, but they know the data much better than I do. But what I want to say is that if something is, it's as if this macro Sudan belt, now it's used as an argument as if the influence of the macro Sudan belt area came later than Proto-Bantu. So it's used to explain something that disappeared, that wasn't Proto-Bantu and disappeared afterwards due to a contact-induced spread coming from the macro-Sudanic belt. But if that macro-Sudanic belt has a time depth of more than 4,000 years, you could also say something was absent because Proto-Bantu was part of the macro-Sudanic belt. And it innovated only later because it had no tree of...
Lack of evidence is lack of evidence. Even if you have some, reason why you can say that there could be lack of evidence, still remains lack of evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
We have to